Good evening. Welcome to the Tolpuddle Radical History School Tuesday evening sessions. This is a complete departure for us from meeting in tents, as we normally do. We've got a couple of minutes before participants arrive. I can see 13 or 14 you have already signed in. So Danny and Angela, what got you interested in history in the first place while we're waiting for people to join us?
Well, we live in Plymouth, and when these 400th anniversary commemorations started, it was kind of opened in 2015, wasn't it, with the Mayflower Museum, and we went to have a look. And they have a problem because they don't have any artifacts. The ship wasn't even registered as coming into port because it wasn't a cargo ship. And so all they've got are the boards, and the statements on the boards were very alarming because there was a marked absence of truth, I think.
I think sanitization is the word that we prefer to use.
Sanitization. of all the reasons I've heard of people getting involved in history, sanitization is a really interesting one. Well, okay, we got 36 participants now. Welcome this evening to the Tolpuddle Radical History School. This will be broadcast on our YouTube channel. It is going to go out on Facebook Live. It's also going to be on our Facebook page. I'll have a link to that tonight. There is a code of conduct which you'll find in the chat section. The code of conduct will be there and you'll be able to see that. Please make sure you've read that before you participate. That would be great. If you've got questions and answers, could you please put those into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen? It says Q&A, and we'll deal with questions at the end of Danny and Angela's presentation. If you'd like to introduce yourselves and tell us who you are and where you're from, that would be absolutely brilliant. I can see Jan and Chris have arrived from Winchelsea. Nice to see you again, Jan and Chris. Michael Butler from the Forest of Dean. All these are staunch supporters of the Tolpuddle Radical History School, but there are other people there, so please introduce yourselves in the chat box. That would be fantastic. Melinda from Dartmoor's appeared, so just between you and I, Danny, really, between Launceston and Plymouth, Dartmoor. Martha's coming from London, Caroline from London, that's great, thank you very much. Dorchester, Eleanor from Ottawa. You're going to have a worldwide chat here. I can see this happening. So all attendees, please introduce yourself. That would be absolutely fantastic. If you could do that for us, that would be great. We've now got 41 participants. We're going to tonight hear from Danny and Angela, who are the Mayflower Mavericks, and have a completely different view of the Mayflower 400 celebrations that are taking part in Plymouth, mainly centered on Plymouth, because that's where the Mayflower sailed from. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Danny and Angela, and they're going to share their presentation with you now. So Danny and Angela, I'm going to hand over to you now if you'd like to share your presentation and start. We'll take questions at the end, so that'll be absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
And we're off, yes?
Yes, I think we are.
Okay. We're going to give a brief presentation centered around the 400-year anniversary of the Mayflower sailing in 1620. It's one of the most remembered events in British colonial history, but this year is special. And major transatlantic commemorations have been planned that involve history education as part of the events.
But this presentation is taking place now in 2020 against another important context, the reinvigoration of the movement against racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. These involved increased pressures to decolonize education through all age groups. What we say today, though very brief, is hopefully a small contribution to this anti-racist movement.
And though what we draw attention to might not be well known, one of our points is that neither is it new. Education about colonialism in the UK is restricted, and we're trying to contribute to highlighting these restrictions.
The presentation will be at times like a podcast with a slide on screen that hopefully connects with what we are trying to say off screen.
To start at the very beginning, the so-called age of exploration. In the early 15th century, as feudalism changed to a wage system, the dominance of trade and merchants grew. It was the imperative of a racialist, capitalist expansion that drove Europeans to explore the lands across the Atlantic, and the doctrine of discovery that gave them license to do so. This doctrine gave the right to colonize, convert, and enslave forever, and was issued initially by popes in the 15th century. However, it constitutes a legal instrument which has been restated and used over the centuries by European powers and their colonial offsprings, and still stands today. In 2005, in the case of City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg noted, quote, "Under the doctrine of discovery, fee title to the lands occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign. First, the discovering European nation, and later the original states and the United States."
You may be aware that in Plymouth, Devon, it was announced 2 months ago that the so-called father of the British slave trade, John Hawkins, was no longer to be honoured by having a square named after him. This happened within 2 days of the removal in Bristol of the statue of the slave trader, Edward Colston. Like Colston, the memory of Hawkins has been sanitised. For example, a plaque in the Mayflower Museum mentions the first Englishman to trade across the Atlantic with the Hawkins family of Plymouth, but it neglects to mention the trading was in slaves.
Following several failed attempts, an ongoing British colonial base was finally established in Virginia, North America in 1607. But it is the Mayflower journey that creates the second British colony in the Americas, New Plymouth, that is the one usually remembered and commemorated.
But why is it that Plymouth takes precedence over the earlier Virginia colony? There are several reasons for this, economic failure being one, and the subsequent discovery of evidence of the practice of cannibalism in the failing Virginia colony. Unlike the Mayflower story, this does not make for a comfortable fit with the construction of the colonizing myth. So the Mayflower story is regularly repurposed to suit the politics of the day, and this is what happened on the 22nd of December, 1769, when Forefathers' Day was inaugurated.
The ship, the Mayflower, arrived off the coast of what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the 9th of November, 1620. Less than half of the 102 passengers were separatist Calvinist Puritans, or pilgrims, who called the remaining group strangers. The strangers, that they were tradesmen basically, who had been recruited by a group of 70 London merchants, the merchant adventurers, who financed the colonial expedition. By April 61, it is estimated that half of all the Plymouth colonists were dead.
Though it should be remembered that the Mayflower journey and the New England colonies it started were part of the colonial histories of Europe, the Americas, and Africa, it isn't always remembered in this way.
The British colonists started their celebrations of the founding of Plymouth in 1769, at a time when protests over the consequences of the Crown's limits on colonial expansion were happening. So ideas about the colonists' distinct roots and independent origins in the Mayflower journey are developing amid disquiet with British Crown rule. In 1775, the now wealthy 13 colonies started a rebellion made possible by wealth accumulated through the West African Caribbean-linked Atlantic trade and sugar and molasses. The tradition of the commemorating the Mayflower mixes up two time periods. The history of 400 years ago is mixed with a story constructed much later, which focuses on the so-called Pilgrim Fathers and their supposed legacy.
In April 1621, the colonists were facing disaster in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The indigenous people of the region, the Wampanoag, taught the colonists how to farm mindful of local conditions, and colonists agreed a peace treaty with the regional sachem Massasoit. But it took a few years before this second British colony, Plymouth, became viable.
In the meantime, there'd been a second major conflict in the first colony, Virginia, between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy in 1622, and the beginnings of a third center of British colonization in the Americas was established in the Caribbean, starting in 1623.
The Caribbean colonies have continued to be a useful resource for Britain. 1948 saw the arrival of the Windrush sailing from the Caribbean with workers to fill the shortage of labour after the Second World War. 1949, the Barbados Beacon advertised for nursing auxiliaries to work in hospitals across Britain. And in 1956, London Transport sent recruitment officers to Barbados. But the Barbados connections with both New and Old England had started when a small group of British colonists had arrived in 1627. One of them was Henry Winthrop, one of the sons of John Winthrop Sr.
John Winthrop had already received a crop of Barbadian tobacco grown by indentured labourers from his son Henry when in 1629 he was granted a colonising charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The next year he led a fleet with 1,000 English Puritans to New England, where they established a neighbouring colony to New Plymouth, with Boston as its capital.
On the screen is a picture of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's badge, made before they set out, with the figure of an Indigenous American saying, "Come over and help us." Now, with a family link, from 1630 onwards, the British colonial centres of New England and Barbados developed close relations, particularly after sugar plantations were established in Barbados in the 1640s. At first, indentured workers were used to work the plantations and process the sugar cane, but they were increasingly replaced by West African enslaved people.
Molasses to rum to slaves provides a handy summing up of the Caribbean New England connections that developed in the 150 years from the Mayflower journey of 1620 to the start of the Mayflower story. Those of a musical disposition can find a song called Molasses to Rum to Slaves on the YouTube, taken from the film version of a famous 1969 Broadway musical called 1776. There's a link on our website too. We did think of singing it to you, but we've saved you from that. Though the infamous slavery triangular trade is usually depicted correctly as having West Africa, the Caribbean, with Old England at one corner, there's a smaller triangle with New England at the apex, inside the Old England one, so to speak.
Molasses is a byproduct of sugarcane processing and is the crucial ingredient for rum refining. Starting with Barbados, the English Caribbean sugar islands traded their molasses up to New England and later New York to be refined into rum. The rum was then shipped to West Africa to be traded for slaves who were taken to the British Caribbean islands. This part of the history of Old and New Englands is what is termed the Atlantic trade.
The Atlantic trade included shipbuilding, rum refining, and slave trading. The British North American colonies became so wealthy through the Atlantic trade that they could contemplate rebellion. This rebellion was rooted in a Crown proclamation issued in 1763 with the ending of the 7 Years' War, stopping the British colonists in North America further expanding beyond the western boundaries of the 13 British Atlantic coast colonies.
You may be interested to know that in a Unitarian church in Boston, Massachusetts, a statue of the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, is to be taken down.
Here's a couple of questions for all you history buffs. How long did the 7 Years' War last?
What famous historical figure was there right at the start of the 7 Years' War?
The first US Vice President and second US President, John Adams, wrote to a friend,
I know not why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in American independence. Many great events have proceeded from much smaller causes.
Now, you might want to say that the Caribbean New England connection is very important for understanding the context for the creation of the Mayflower story.
Or you might want to say it's just a part of the contextualizing of the Mayflower story.
But what you shouldn't say is nothing.
There is much written and reported that comes under the heading Mayflower. Some of it might be dismissed as historical gossip of the did you know variety. For example, did you know that the famous Mayflower pilgrim Edward Winslow was the head civilian commissioner on the British invasion fleet that eventually took Jamaica in May 1665? That's it.
Sorry?
Leave that one.
Oh, right. I beg your pardon. The British invasion fleet landed on the then Spanish colony of Jamaica a few days after Winslow had died on board one of the surviving ships coming from the islands of Hispaniola. The British attempt to take this much bigger and better defended island had just been defeated by the Spanish there.
For this defeat, the ruler of Britain in 1655, the Calvinist Puritan Lord High Protector Oliver Cromwell put the two military commissioners for this important Caribbean invasion, known as Western Design, in the Tower of London.
As Cromwell was a Puritan, it isn't surprising that he appointed Winslow, a fellow Puritan, as a commissioner. But what is a little surprising is that when teaching British history and telling the Mayflower story, Jamaica isn't more to the fore. After all, Jamaica was subsequently very important for the growth of the British economy and the economies of the North American colonies.
The establishment and growth in the 17th and 18th centuries of the British Caribbean colonies were bound up with population decline in Africa as a result of the slave trade.
Let us take a minute to look at the quotes from the book by the historian Robin Blackburn, The Making of New World Slavery, from the Baroque to the modern, 1492 to 1800, and reflect on the extent and damage inflicted on West African societies by such drastic population decline.
We'll take a minute for that, yeah?
Just give them a few seconds.
Yeah. Okay.
Have you finished? Have you read it?
Okay. Of course, there was large-scale, rapid indigenous population decline in North America as a result of British colonial expansion starting in the 17th century. It also involved enslavement, but whereas Africans were captured in wars so that they might be sold, Native Americans in New England were sold because they had been captured in wars of colonial expansion.
In order to produce foodstuffs, rear livestock, build ships, refine rum, and develop trade, land was seized from the Indigenous Nations who had lived and farmed in the area for hundreds of generations. These land seizures were undertaken by various means, including war.
Hunger and disease went hand in hand with loss of territory, which led to loss of food stocks, farmland, and hunting land. Widespread malnutrition followed, resulting in dramatic and lethal increases in susceptibility to disease.
Colonization involved what one historian of New England slavery, Wendy Warren, described as unplanting the indigenous people and replanting with settlers and with slaves, both indigenous and African. As more colonists arrived and settler frontiers moved north, south, and west, indigenous peoples were either decimated, forced to become embroiled in wars, or both. In 1636 to 38, the colonists' war against the Pequot Nation in the area now known as Connecticut involved not only massacre, but enslavement, hence the need for the first British colonial slave law passed in 1641 in Massachusetts.
Of the other wars that followed the Pequot War, what is known as King Philip's War, 1675 to 76, is relevant to both the Mayflower and the subsequent development of frontier warfare. On the screen is just a part of a text of a plaque commemorating Metacomet, that's King Philip, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, Post Office Square. Metacomet, King Philip, called upon all native people to unite to defend their homeland against encroachment. His head was impaled on a pike and was displayed for more than 20 years. His wife and son were sold into slavery in the West Indies by the English victors.
On September the 9th, 1675, Plymouth colony governor Josiah Winslow, son of the famous Mayflower pilgrim Edward Winslow, signed a declaration of war against the Wampanoag sachem Metacomet, known to history as King Philip. Metacomet was the son of Massasoit, the sachem who in 1620 had helped the Mayflower settlers.
Though the combined populations of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island and Connecticut in 1600 had been estimated at 60,000, by 1675, quote, prior to King Philip's War, New England's native population was probably 30,000. By the 1770s, the region's population had fallen to perhaps 3,500, a decline of close to 90% in a century, end quote.
Other books and reports provide illuminating statistics for trade and changes in land area designated as Indian.
Or accounts of colonization related to wars during the 17th and 18th century.
Up on your screen is a quote from a very useful book for contextualizing the Mayflower journey, for when the Mayflower journey happened, and when the Mayflower story was created in terms of wars. Published in 2008, it was written by a military historian, John Grenier, and covers North America in the period 1607 to 1814. We'll give you a moment to read the quote.
Yeah. The word scalp hunting is accurate. Important have been histories written by African American, Indigenous American, and Caribbean scholars over the years, and whose successors continue to prompt a review of the way colonialism is taught. A recent example is the book on your screen by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, published in 2014.
However, last year she went further and republished an edition of this book that was both updated and specifically orientated towards teaching and labeled for young people.
Democracy. An important part of the story of the Mayflower deals with the issue of democratic representative government.
Noticeable is an agreement or covenant between the two factions of Mayflower passengers. These were the slightly smaller group of Puritan Calvinist separatists, now usually called the Pilgrims, and the others who the Pilgrims called strangers. This agreement document, you've got it on your screen, it's not a great copy, I'm afraid, was signed by 41 of the 50 male passengers to ensure that disagreements that had arisen didn't spill over into separate settlements.
You see, the ship had been driven off course and ended up off the coast of New England. They were now 3,000 miles from Old England and 250 miles from the mouth of the Hudson, near modern-day New York. This area, not New England, was the territory the colonists had been assigned in the patent of the Mayflower's investors and granted by the Virginia Company, acting as agents for King James I. The colonists had no right in English law to be where they were and needed to restate their loyalty to the king. They covenanted to, quote, combine ourselves together into a civil body politic.
Now you can see on the screen a photograph taken in the Mayflower Museum of a document called the Mayflower Compact in 1620. It isn't, of course, the original agreement, which was first reproduced in a book published in London in 1622 called Mort's Relation, probably written by two of the famous pilgrims, William Bradford and Edward Winslow, and maybe others as well.
But this covenant or agreement has for some 200 years been widely taught as the Mayflower Compact, a pioneering work of democracy. But politicians only started calling it the Mayflower Compact in the 1790s in the newly formed USA following the victory of the 13 colonies.
The government leaders in the new nation state, which was now itself a federation of states, were in the early 1790s as divided as the Mayflower passengers had been. Those emphasizing the federal character of the 13 states were opposed by anti-federalists. Those who feared the influence of the French Revolution warned against too much democracy, while neither federalists or anti-federalists wished to be associated with the British Crown or its legal traditions.
The then largely forgotten 1620 agreement or covenant made on the Mayflower offered the Federalists a middle propaganda route. And in 1791 lecture, Federalist founding father and contributor drafter to the US Constitution, James Wilson, unearthed and used a copy of the covenant to root support for the US Constitution back in the early 17th century.
So the agreement became rebranded as the Mayflower Compact, and in 1802, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, the first vice president and second president of the USA, and who himself later became the sixth president, promoted the Mayflower Compact in a famous speech about democracy in 1802. The rest, as they say, is history.
Or more correctly, history education.
As you will see on the screen, there are very different interpretations of the history of the Mayflower Compact.
This might seem to you to be going to a lot of trouble just to show variety of interpretation in history. Hardly a novel idea.
But in our defense, we would point out that for students, this controversy is to be left out entirely.
Only the traditional version emphasizing the asserted connection between the 1620 Covenant and democratic association is presented to pupils in schools, along with the section on the speech made by John Quincy Adams in 1802 for discussion.
1802 was the time when anti-federalist Jefferson was president. The following year, the territory of the USA doubled with the Louisiana Purchase of some 828,000 square miles. Napoleon Bonaparte, who claimed ownership of this vast central strip from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, sold it to the US government to raise money for his wars against Britain. Ironically, the leading UK bank at the time, Barings, acted as the brokers for the sale, making a considerable profit. And then, of course, Barings later went on to act as a source of finance to the US government during their war of 1812 to 15 with the UK, sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence.
Though Jefferson's presidency ended in 1809, it had included the commencement of a new phase in colonial expansion, land seizure and plantation slavery. And this phase of land seizures led to the infamous Removal Act of 1830.
The act covered an estimated 123,000 Indigenous people who were to be moved west to the newly acquired areas. These territories were already populated by long settled Indigenous natives, but were now designated removal zones. Though the numbers actually forcibly driven west aren't accurately known, what is known is the huge negative impact these removals had on Indigenous land, area, and territorial rights. Moreover, removal policy enforcement did not involve anything like adequate planning about location, route, weather conditions for the removal journey, the poor health condition of those forced to leave their homes, food supplies, warm clothing preparations, or indeed most aspects of the process, despite the often perilous conditions that those forcibly moved could be expected to encounter.
Removal decisions did not allow for reconsideration, though they did occasionally lead to groups already relocated being further removed, relocated, and dispossessed as the authorities shrunk the size of the removal zones. Not surprisingly, death rates on these removal journeys, sometimes called trails of tears, were very high.
These deadly implementation patterns by government administrators of East-West removal policy went on for some 20 years and went mostly publicly unreported. More Indigenous Nations lands were becoming included in the USA. As new territory was conquered or claimed, these too became the target for further devastating colonial expansion.
The 90% population drop of Eastern Indigenous nations in the 100 years following early British 17th century colonisation was a result of ongoing land seizures and the malnutrition, trauma, and social destruction they caused. These patterns of social damage were repeated over the next 200 years of colonial expansion across North America. As author Jeffrey Ostler mentioned on screen, points out elsewhere in his book, virgin soil epidemic explanations that attributed epidemics of unfamiliar contagious disease alone are not only being challenged, but so too is the accidental character of the high death rates attributable to disease.
Having reviewed all the arguments and evidence in detail, Ostler concludes, I could not escape the conviction that what I was witnessing had to be considered genocide.
Each Thanksgiving Day since 1970 in Plymouth, Massachusetts, there has been a gathering of Indigenous Americans for a day of mourning. Perhaps we should read the thing on the screen together.
The text of the plaque on Coles Hill, Plymouth, Massachusetts. Since 1970, Native Americans have gathered at noon on Coles Hill in Plymouth to commemorate a national day of mourning on the US Thanksgiving holiday.
Many Native Americans do not celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims and the other European settlers. To them, Thanksgiving Day is a reminder of the genocide of millions of their people, the theft of their lands, and the relentless assault on their culture.
Participants in a national day of mourning honor Native ancestors and the struggle of Native peoples to survive today.
It is a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest of the racism and oppression which Native Americans continue to experience. We will start taking questions in a couple of minutes.
On the screen is a picture of a book published at the end of 2018 in preparation for the 400th anniversary commemorations. How to order copies is shown on the Mayflower Mavericks website. The address is being displayed now. But the title also gives you some preview of our take on the issues involved. Thanksgiving or land grabbing, massacres and slavery. We will take questions in a couple of minutes.
Danny and Angela, would you like to stop sharing the screen now then?
Yep.
That's great. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Thank you for that. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we'll have some interesting questions with regard to it. I'd like to start just with one. I think you referred to it, Angela, about Roanoke, which I thought was founded first of all in 1605 and then re-established in 1607, because it's important we remember that the Mayflower Pilgrims weren't the first Europeans to land in North America, were they?
No, I didn't mention Roanoke, but I mean, there were sailors up and down that coast before even Roanoke. There were, yes, there were lots of European visitors. And that's part of the attributing disease myth.
Yeah, that's the point I was coming to, was that even before the Puritans, the Mayflower settlers had got there, in fact, European fishermen, Roanoke and other settlements had already introduced diseases which had fairly decimated some of those American indigenous people along the eastern seaboard. Is that right?
Wampanoag were severely, so how many, what was the percentage of?
Well, they reckon about the group of Wampanoag who, at the area where they established Plymouth had suffered a 90% loss in the 3 years previously, because if they'd have turned up, if the Mayflower had turned up back in 1616, say, they'd have met a society where there were 1,500 people prepared for a fight, and as it transpired, that was not the case. It was more like 150.
Yeah, okay.
Part of the reason why they did not face immediate military opposition.
And am I right in thinking, even I think in 1621, 2 North American indigenous people turned up who actually spoke English to help the settlers out for a little bit?
Oh, that's very interesting. That's,
yes. there are 2 distinct stories about that, because there are 2.
I thought there might be.
But I mean, you can read those, because in themselves they're part of the controversy about that episode. And really, if you don't mind, Les, I don't really want him to get into the ins and outs of that. I think they're very interesting and they're very controversial stories, and they're very interesting episodes. But our main point is basically the way that the Mayflower story is presented, decontextualized from what went before in terms of other European powers, the Spanish and the Portuguese, and what came after, but the British and the French and the Dutch when they get involved as well.
Can we just?
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting point you're making. I haven't got a problem with it at all. Certainly by 1700, there were something like 300,000 Europeans along that seaboard. And the numbers you gave about the decimation of indigenous people were just amazing, weren't they? 60,000 to 30,000 to 3,500.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we'd already by 1700 imported something like 300,000 people to North America.
That's right.
Is, you know.
And initially, the bigger outgoings from Britain was down to the Caribbean, but yes, they increasingly started going to the Americas. But one of the things that I think is important is the neglect of the Caribbean when telling the Mayflower story.
It's actually never mentioned, and that's what the 13 colonies built their wealth on. That's how they could rebel, and they had to have a British have a slave law, didn't they?
Mm.
Yeah, this is what they went to war. So we've got a couple of questions come in. Very good talk, thank you very much. The New York Times did the 1619 project, including a recommended project which asserts that not all America were equal at the time of independence. Do you have any comments about how certain US Republicans are now attacking the 1619 Project, saying that slavery was necessary? All this in the lead up to the presidential election.
For those people who don't know what the question's getting at, there's a senator. He's called Tom Cotton. He's Arkansas. Do you say Arkansas Republican?
Arkansas.
And he's one of the people that people are already picking out as a potential presidential candidate in 2024. And this 1619 Project, which is because in 1619 the Virginia colonists, it was the first time that they imported African slaves.
They bought them off that visiting ship, the White Lion, didn't they?
Yes.
Portuguese, yeah. I think. Yeah.
I thought it was Dutch. Anyway, I think the point about the 1619 is, even though they weren't technically slaves because they didn't have a slave law, this is the beginning, and they formulate this project, the 1619 Project curriculum, and you know, it's a very welcome development. It went for funding at federal level, and this guy is trying to move at what is called the Prohibition of Federal Funds Saving America History Act of 2020, and obviously that's incredibly controversial, and it goes to show just how important the racism rooted in history is, and it's true in the United States, and it is true, and we have to face up to this in the United Kingdom too.
Yep.
Okay, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, you're clearly very interested in education, both of you, and I think the whole history of colonization has been probably very badly dealt with, both in America and in Great Britain. I think you both agree with that, wouldn't you? So I've got a question here from Steve Cushion. How does this affect the campaign for reparations for slavery?
Well, I think that the campaign for reparations for slavery is very much something that is West Indian, Caribbean campaigners have taken up, African campaigners have taken up. It is not the same in other communities which are relevant. And I think that I think that people should be aware that the costing has been done about reparations. In fact, the questioner knows this very well because he's written a little pamphlet about it.
Yes.
Okay. Carol Vincent has written the Mundanuca people in Latin America and other tribal indigenous people in Chile and El Salvador are struggling now with COVID-19. Bolsonaro is openly saying he wants the Indians killed off, which makes your talk very apposite at this time politically, doesn't it? The clearing of the forest and land of the people are coming in, are killing very many elders. It seems very much the same. Sorry, I don't know why you're apologizing, Carol, but that seems to me to be a very apposite point you're making there.
Yes.
Any comments on that?
Yes, well, I think that I'm not an expert in what is happening as a result of the neglect of COVID in the Americas, but I do follow the reports like the questioner about what is happening, and I'm just more and more shocked that people can do this so blatantly, and I think that the consequences of racism and the consequences of this neglect, the consequences of colonialism, and it just emphasizes the urgency of the need to do something about educating people about colonialism, because it is much an issue as today. It is still a very, very urgent and pressing issue.
It is. Melinda has written in recommending a book, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory by Claudio Sant, 2020. Publisher Norton and Company. This is an excellent account of the removals of the 1830s and links to the plantation economy and slavery. Do you know that? It's obviously a very recent book.
Yes, I've heard of that book, and I hope to get hold of a copy. the book I was drawing upon was a book called Surviving. The one that I presented on, that we presented on screen, was
Dunbar Otis, or
no, the Jeffrey Ostler book.
Oh yes.
Yeah, so it covers the similar territory, but I'm very anxious with what Melinda suggests. Somebody worth listening to, actually, Melinda is, and I'm anxious to get hold of a copy of that myself. I find getting hold of books from America that are relevant, that they're not always straightforward, and particularly over the last 3 months, they've been difficult to get hold of. But thank you for that. Maybe we could put that. Could we put that, Les, available on the details of that book? Because
yeah, we can find it. We can find it and try and put it up somewhere. And maybe that'll give you a chance. I'm hoping next year you'll come to the Radical History School in our tent in Tolpuddle, and you'll be able to give a different talk to the one today. But you know, maybe by that time you'll have read that book, and it may have added to your contribution to the Radical History School next year. Michael Butler's come in with, there are two very good podcasts that are worth listening to: the New York Times 1619 and the podcast Seen on Radio. The fourth series is particularly relevant. The Land That Has Never Been Yet. I don't know that at all. Amanda Nolan has written, what do you think about the rejection by our government to change our history curriculum to add in more Black history? Great talk, by the way.
Take a guess what we think about it. It's there's this whole, even here, where they're bringing down the changing the name of Sir John Hawkins Square. There's been opposition, and like in Bristol, there's the, oh, you're taking our history, you're destroying our history, and there's the same movement in America. So I'm not really surprised they've made that refusal, but I think the NEU, our union, is aiming for it, aren't they? The Trades Council here has been working for it, the southwest area of the TUC, because it's things have to change, need to change. There is racism because there is not the education to combat it.
Part of the move to decolonize education has been misrepresented in the media as subtracting, where in actual fact that what people are trying to do is add, and it's a calculated misrepresentation to present something that's positive, namely teach more and teach about colonialism, as taking away history, when in actual fact it's adding to our education. And I'm afraid the media has a lot to answer for this, for the constant misrepresentation of the decolonizing of education movement, which I think that the struggle is not over yet. Just because the government has rejected this, it's hardly surprising from this government, but it's not over yet. My union isn't finished with this for certain.
No, I agree very much with that. I think when you went to the exhibition and you saw the boards, or you went to an early version of the exhibition, you saw the boards. Am I right in thinking that the boards in the exhibition sort of whitewashed this whole area?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, there is very. I mean, if you go on our website, we try to detail there, and in the book that we published, we try to detail exactly what was included and what was left out, and we use the word sanitization because things are completely left out. And when they opened that museum in 2015, it was actually rather shocking. What was left out, and this is it was a focusing just on the pilgrims and the myths about and the neglect of the decimations of African and Indigenous American people.
And they got a box of clothes for children to dress up as pilgrims. That was their notion of education, I think. Oh.
I've got a question from Chris Reed here. Great talk, thank you. You quoted revisionist ideas about the motivations of the pilgrims. Well, what do you now see as their main purpose in heading for New England?
They'd been in Leiden. There's loads of myths. They were supposed to be religious refugees, but they'd lived in Leiden for 13 years, and life was tough. They were tolerated religiously, but I think they were economic migrants, basically, and they were, you know, they wanted a better life. And the merchant adventurers wanted profit, which is why they financed it and put, I mean, the figures of how many were actually separatists are not secure. I've seen it as low as 35, and the rest were the strangers. And they were tradesmen. They were put in there by the merchant adventurers in order to make money.
I think also that we have to remember that the Mayflower journey was only one journey. When we talked about, we tried to refocus things on John Winthrop, because when those 1,000 Puritans go across, who are not separatists, but they're Puritans, they're in the same sort of religious ballpark area, that when they go across, you get a big step up of the colonizers, and it opens the door, and you get many more in the course of the 1630s. It's the first step that is what happens in 1620, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and with it, the population of the indigenous people goes down as the population of the colonists goes up.
Mm.
This was a chance for a new life in a new area, which promised some mythical idea of wealth, really, in a way, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, but the point was that the people who were living there were basically treated as if the land that they worked, that the land that they lived on, that they had no right to it, and that the colonists had the right to take it off them. Which is why when we raised the question of the Pequot War of 1636 to 38, that's the first of the big ones up in New England. It's not the first clash, but it is the first big one. And you've got this threat of violence and actual violence that is a feature of British colonization along that coast up till the rebellion when in 1775. The British are in charge of, and there's a series of wars. It's a series of wars, and that book that we pointed to documents this.
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that there were a number of different reasons why people went, both in 1620 and after 1620. The separatists and the strangers actually had two different rationale for going. Would that be fair?
Well, sorry.
Well, yes, I think the strangers were there. It was part of a profit seeking. And I think the separatists wanted a better life. But as I say, I always describe them as economic migrants.
Some of them were indentured
yeah,
work.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. I understand that. Yeah. Martha Riley's written, totally agree with the media conflating with this. Totally agree, the media are conflating this with the delete culture. Do you want to comment on that? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Martha. I think what she's saying is that you made a comment that the media weren't helping the idea that colonization should be taught in schools, and she's saying she totally agrees with you. Charlie Pitts has written, this is Charlie from Ottawa. I just want to thank you personally for your work in writing this pamphlet. It's provided to me by somebody very special to both of us. Your publication has enlightened me more on this subject than anything I've ever learned in a history class in school. We need allies like you. Thank you so very much, and please continue your work. Not exactly a question, but there you are. A certain amount of praise there. Do you know, Charlie?
No, we don't. We suspect that
our niece lives in Canada, so that could be.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Marigold Bentley's written. Thanks very much for the presentation. Great. Why do you think the Mayflower Museum gives such a partial and narrow view of history? Who benefits from such a perspective?
I hope the box, which is the new museum, which is being built in Plymouth, opening next month, I hope it is better. But when they set up the Mayflower Museum, as I said before, they didn't have any artifacts, they didn't have anything, but they also had what they wanted to do was tell one story, one story about the ship and the pilgrims and the, the hardy refugees crossing the wintry seas and then getting on really nicely with the native inhabitants. And that was how they wanted to portray it. And that's the standard myth that has been passed down through too many of the commemorations. And I'm hoping that by next year things might have changed, that when they extend these, yeah, I know it's
there might be some improvement. When they opened the museum in 2015, things have got a little better, just a little better, and possibly they'll get a little better in the course of the next few months. There are certainly people pressing to do that, I know. But what you had back in 2015 was a deliberate attempt to keep it narrow, to keep it traditional. The 300th anniversary in 1920, the 350th anniversary in 1970, the 400th anniversary when they started running it in 2015 was to follow in that sanitized tradition. And that's why we've been pressing, and we're among those that have been pressing. We're not alone. There's lots of groups have been pressing for an improvement. And I think that we're optimistic that we should, and we would invite people who are here today to join us in pressing the Mayflower 400 to improve their education, to include the Caribbean connection, to improve their coverage of the consequences and the background and the context of the Mayflower journey, because that is what is mostly the problem: the lack of context, the lack of background.
And what we said in the course of the talk, none of this is new. This is all known. There are many, many scholars who have written it. And so it is to be blamed if they choose to ignore all of that and stick to their one story.
So what's the NEU in Plymouth trying to do about that? Because you're the people on the ground in Plymouth, aren't you?
Well, I mean, we're one among a number of organisations which have tried to press the local authority, to press the Mayflower 400 organisation to change things, to improve things. There are some projects that are associated with the Mayflower 400 organisation which look very good, but unfortunately they're not at the centre. And what remains at the centre is this focus on the pilgrims and who descended from the pilgrims, what happened in 1620, what happened in 1621, and the minutiae, rather than the real important matter of the context, the colonial context in which it took place, and the colonial and devastating consequences of what happened, both in terms of slavery, land grabbing, and massacres.
I think we've got one more question, which will probably be our last one for tonight, because we're running up close to the 8 o'clock barrier. We've got a few minutes yet. This is from Chris Reed. Do you think coexistence between settlers and the indigenous peoples was doomed from the start?
If you forgive me,
Thank you, Chris.
I'm afraid I don't know about you, but I'd prefer not to answer, to speculate like that. There are people who look back at King Philip's War and say, you know, if they'd have had different tactics, they could have won that one. And you just don't want to get drawn into that. History happened. What we've got to see is that the teaching of that history affects what happens now. And we need to stop sanitizing that history, and we need to stop sanitizing it very soon.
I absolutely agree with that. Thank you. That's one last question, just very quickly come in. How much evidence do we have about the lives of the separatists? I think we got quite a lot, Mo, really.
How much evidence?
Yeah.
Well, actually, as a matter of fact, not even the number who went are secure. There's not that many we have a list of them. There's a list down in the Barbican of them. But the women were not, of course, did not sign the covenant. And also only 4 of the separatist women survived that journey. They died in the harbour, a lot of them. The women stayed on the ship and the men went ashore and built. And so only 4 of them survived, and the widowers were hastily married off to their daughters. And that's another aspect which we haven't touched on at all, about the destruction of women's role in the indigenous societies, in the colonized societies. Because when the settlers went over, they took all their notions of land as real estate, as food for trade. They took everything like that with them. And the destruction on the culture was phenomenal. And I've actually forgotten what the question was now.
How much information do we have about the lives of the separatists? I'm pretty sure you've answered it. There's quite a lot of accounts of actually life in the colony, isn't there?
Yes, and there's lots of books actually published this year.
There's Mort's Relation as well.
Yeah. So in the chat, if you're still with us, thank you very much for attending tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. I found it a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more on this topic in the months and the year to come. And if you get a chance to get to Plymouth and look at the exhibition, I'm sure you'll come to your own views about it. Just to point out to you, there are still 3 Tuesday evening sessions to come. The next one next week on the 11th of August with Rachel Holmes, the Sylvia Pankhurst Handbook. On the 18th of August is Whose Heritage Is It Anyway? With Steve Paul. And on the 25th of August, Workplace Surveillance, Then and Now, with Steve Parfitt. So I'm hoping to see you here on our regular Tuesday night session. There's lots of very nice messages come in. Thank you very much. I've learned a lot. Thanks so much from Melinda. Great and very informative. Sonia, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I feel motivated to do a lot more reading. From Amanda, thank you. Very interesting. Great talk. From Hayley Kemp, thanks, Danny and Andrew and the TUC. Great talk. Kate Lattimore, great talk. Nigel Clossy saying it will be available on the Tolpuddle Facebook and YouTube sites. That will happen. It'll certainly be on YouTube tomorrow. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you to everybody involved. You're getting the idea, Danny and Angela. People have really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much for your time and effort. I hope you're going to come and talk to us in the tent next year. Is that a possibility?
Oh, yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I shall be inviting you later in the year, and I look forward to seeing you, hopefully, in a field in Dorchester next July. Thank you so much for the time and effort you put into your presentation. It's been a pleasure to work with you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope all of you who've tuned in have enjoyed it tonight. And it's time for us to say good night. So thank you very much and goodbye. Right. Bye-bye.
What happens now?